Professor of Israeli Studies at the University of California, and he joins us now from Los Angeles. Welcome to the programme. We're hearing the argument of morality of giving Israel military aid that US lawmakers are discussing right now. How strong is that?
Well, I think this isn't really so much of a moral argument as an argument in terms of Americans' strategic interest in maintaining a strong relationship, a strong alliance with Israel. And as your report noted, it's also something of an economic subsidy to American arms manufacturers. Much of the money that the United States gives Israel in terms of military aid is actually spent on Israel's acquisition of American weapons systems, American arms. So although there is a strong belief in Congress and among many Americans that the United States should support Israel and that US military aid to Israel is justified, it also really isn't so much of a kind of selfless act on supporting Israel as something that also benefits the United States, American arms manufacturers, and ultimately Americans who get jobs through those weapons development.
And could anything change with the new Israeli coalition if it holds?
Well, I think, if anything, a different government and different leader, in particular in Jerusalem, is only going to improve US-Israel relations. Netanyahu has been a very unpopular figure for some time among Democrats in the United States, among liberals more broadly. He is somebody who was really seen to have aligned Israel very closely with the Republican Party and with President Trump in particular. So if he does indeed leave office, I think that will be welcomed by the Biden administration and certainly by many Democrats in Congress. And it will, in the short term at least, improve US-Israel relations. But in terms of the underlying issues of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, Israel's policy towards the Palestinians, it's still something that Democrats particularly are going to be taking issue with. And I think there's still going to be a desire among many Democrats, at least in Congress, to really scrutinize US aid to Israel going forward, not necessarily to cut it back or to condition it, but to at least make sure that there's more transparency about how that aid is spent and to ensure that US weapons aren't being used against Palestinian civilians.
And what exactly changed after the 11-day Gaza offensive in the US and the debate regarding Israel's, the US support for Israel?
Well, I think two things shifted. One was really in Congress, where you saw not only, a few well-known progressive Democrats like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others in very outspoken in their support for the Palestinians and their criticism of Israel. But even more significant within Congress, I think, was the fact that many mainstream kind of centrist Democrats were also pretty critical of Israel's military actions in the conflict and calling for an immediate ceasefire. And that's really an important development, is this shift, not just the criticisms from progressives, but in the center of the Democratic Party being more willing to criticize Israel, criticize Israeli military actions, and call for an immediate ceasefire, and even to call for a restriction or a suspension of US arms sales to Israel. The other development outside of Congress in American society at large was this outpouring of support on social media and on the streets of American cities for the Palestinians. And I think that speaks to a shift in public attitudes that's been taking place for some time, where Americans who have long been strongly supportive of Israel and really siding with Israel over the Palestinians for a long time are now not really turning against Israel, but becoming at least more sympathetic toward the Palestinians, more aware of Palestinian grievances and of the Palestinian narrative, particularly young Americans. And it's young Americans in particular who I think were being very vocal in their criticisms on social media in particular. So I think there is a shift. We've seen this already take place in other Western countries. It has happened much more slowly in the United States, but there is a shift in public attitudes, and even now in Washington, D.C. itself. But I don't think it's going to result in any significant changes in US policy anytime soon.
Dov Waxman, thank you so much for coming on the programme. I appreciate your time and thoughts.